Hello, my friends. The AZ-500 exam is a tough one I know many of you are preparing for, so I'll make you a deal. You give me an hour-ish of your time, and I'll help you get further, faster in your AZ-500 exam prep. Let's do it. Welcome to the first in this four-part AZ-500 Exam Cram series. Now, I'll talk to you in a bit about how the series is organized, but first I want to talk to you for a minute about the AZ-500 exam itself and what you can expect. So this is for the Azure Security Engineer Associate certification, and I like to say that AZ-500 has two things in common with the Grand Canyon. The first is it's very wide. It covers a broad range of Microsoft technologies, both IaaS and PaaS technologies and how you secure them, and the security services and features in Azure themselves. Like the Grand Canyon, this exam is also quite deep. You will be tested on the depth of your knowledge around services and features and how to secure them, and you may encounter scenarios that require you to implement multiple services to meet multiple requirements based on certain criteria. So you really have to have a fair bit of face time with these services, I think, in order to expect to be very successful in this exam. It's not one you can easily just study your way to very quickly. So this exam consists of 4 high-level knowledge domains coming right out of the AZ-500 skills tested. The first is manage identity and access. The second is implement platform protection. The third is manage security operations, and the fourth, secure data and applications. So the objectives, the goals of the AZ-500 exam cram series are pretty simple. I want to help you prepare for this exam faster. I'm going to provide you with a way to help you focus your study. So we're going to surface some key areas of knowledge, some terminology associations, and over the course of this 4-part series, your weak spots will be exposed. But we want to tie some key terms and terminology together to help your recall on exam day. Nothing counts more than studying in such a way that when you get into the weeds with that deep scenario, you can come back to some anchor information that will help you work your way through that scenario, reason your way to the right answer, because you can't possibly predict what all those scenarios will be. All in all, I think this series will be a good use of the first and last hours of your study time. So if you're not yet preparing for AZ-500, this series will certainly offer some clues in a very short amount of time. If it's your last hour of study, or near your last hour of study, it may give you some key anchor information that helps your recall on exam day. But bottom line, I want to help you get further, faster as you're preparing for AZ-500. So the series is laid out much like the AZ-500 skills measured. At the top of a slide, when I'm showing you the skills information, you'll see the knowledge domain at the top. You'll see those level 2 headings beneath. I call those the subdomains. And then you'll see the bullet list items, which are the individual skills tested. If I were to just show you the AZ-500 skills measured, it's the very same thing. You see the domain, you see that level 2 heading, the subdomain, and then the individual skills tested. Simple as that. And if you follow this series, it's going to follow the skills tested from domain 1 to domain 2 in order. So I also want to give you a heat map. Just what percentage of content can you expect on the exam? So Microsoft says that manage identity and access will comprise about 30 to 35% of this exam, which means fully a third of the questions you see could be around managing identity and access. Now, these exams are also adaptive, so that may not be your experience depending on your knowledge level. If you answer certain questions right, you may be moved on adaptively to other areas. That's pretty difficult to predict, I think. So when you see this for the exam slide, anywhere you see this, you can rest assured that on the right-hand side, you're going to see one of two things. An important fact to remember for the AZ-500 exam, or a key area to prepare for the exam. Like the AZ-500 skills measured document, which says it is not exhaustive. It's impossible for anybody to be exhaustive for you, but we can take clues from that skills measured document and more effectively prepare for our exam. So today we're working on domain 1, manage identity and access. These are the subdomains that come right out of that document. So let's dig in. So number 1 is configure Azure AD identities. So you may see questions on the exam around service principals, Azure AD groups and users, as well as password writeback. Now this one might seem kind of odd to you. It's sort of an odd standalone phrase to come out here, password writeback. So I'll explain why that is so important and why it's there in just a moment. So just continuing down the items in this subdomain, configuring authentication methods, including password hash and pass-through authentication, OAuth, and passwordless. We'll talk about pass-through authentication in particular. I think is one that's pretty popular, and I tend to think that modern features and popular features are more likely to come up on exam, so that's where you want to spend time. Transferring Azure subscriptions between Azure AD tenants is important, and transferring a subscription, incidentally, is going to have an impact on role and permission assignment and the state of services potentially in that subscription. So if you don't know what those impacts are, there's a document out there. It's actually in my AZ-500 exam prep guide that will explain the impact of a transfer of Azure subscription. So you want to give that a read and more or less memorize what's happening there. So for the exam, let's hit some of the key points here. So I mentioned password writeback. So the synchronized identity model is the most common identity model implemented today. So there's the cloud identity model that's purely Azure AD identities. There's the synchronized identity model where we're synchronizing identities between our on-prem Active Directory and Azure AD, and then there's the federated model, which typically would involve something like ADFS. So Azure AD Connect and password writeback really facilitate this synchronized identity model. So Azure AD Connect is our engine for synchronization. Now, password writeback comes into play as a key component when we implement Azure AD self-service password reset. When we allow a user to reset their password, we immediately have a password that's out of sync with the on-premises identity in Active Directory, and password writeback is what writes back that updated password to the Active Directory user on premises. So password writeback is really important in that respect, as that it helps us implement single sign-on and a great user experience for that synchronized identity model that is the most commonly implemented today. Pass-through authentication forwards the authentication request down to on-prem Active Directory. So I see this used in scenarios such as the need to enforce logon hours. So pass-through authentication can come into play in a scenario like that. So you want to definitely spend a little time with PTA. I expect that could well come up on the exam. And you didn't see ADFS of the federated model come up, so I would tend to be much less interested in studying those items. So also on the exam, you'll see service principals mentioned quite possibly. There are two types of authentication for service principals. There's you can provide a secret, effectively a password, or certificate. So definitely you want to know that and how to set those. Now, managed identity, I think, is likely to come up as well. And a managed identity is essentially a layer on top of service principal that removes the need for you to manually create and manage service principals directly. And there are two types of managed identities, and you want to be familiar with these. They're system assigned and user assigned. System assigned is lowest effort in terms of lifecycle management because it's tied to the resource that you provision. So a system assigned managed identity is provisioned with the resource. It is retired or removed with the resource. User assigned, on the other hand, is flexible in that it can be shared across multiple resources. But since you're doing the creating there, you're managing the life cycle. So when you retire all the resources that it's associated with, you have to deprovision or remove that user identity, that user assigned managed identity yourself. So number 2, configuring secure access by using Azure AD. So we have monitoring privileged identity management, or PIM as we call it, configuring access reviews, which is a feature within PIM, activating your available roles, your eligible roles, and configuring PIM, also potentially in scope here. Also, implementing conditional access policies, including multi-factor authentication. And notice that keyword including. That should really mean including, but not limited to, multi-factor authentication. That's the subtext you want to be aware of there. And Azure AD Identity Protection brings something interesting to the party, particularly when it comes to conditional access, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. So if I were to break this down, I can really break this list into two parts. So we have privileged identity management. So for PIM, you need to know how to configure, activate those eligible roles, how to monitor use of PIM. So you need to know PIM pretty thoroughly, and we'll talk about a couple of key areas to focus your time. Also here, conditional access and identity protection. This falls into the authentication bucket, and we'll talk about what identity protection brings to the party in just a moment. So if you're getting value from this video, do make sure to give us a like and subscribe. You'll be notified that way every time we add a new Azure tutorial or exam prep video here. So for the exam, I want to point out a couple of areas that you probably know you should study around privileged identity management, and a couple of items that you might not think about. So know how to configure privileged identity management and know the difference between role assignments that are eligible versus those that are permanent. Know your way around the configuration options for access reviews. For example, that you can assign specific reviewers, or you can configure a self-access review where users can tell you if they need continuing access to those eligible roles, and that you can determine behavior for users who failed to respond to your access reviews. Now, to delegate access to PIM, a global admin can assign other users to the privileged role administrator role, just worth mentioning. And know that Microsoft recommends 0 permanent active assignments except your break glass accounts, which should have permanent global administrator role access. So beware of any questions that mention permanent assignments. Those could be distractors. Because we're talking about admin access here, it's worth mentioning who can manage assignments for other admins in PIM. So for Azure AD roles, only privileged role administrators and global administrator can manage other admin access. For Azure resource roles, only subscription admin, resource owner, or resource user access administrators can do the job. You definitely need to know how to configure Azure AD conditional access. So configuring a conditional access policy and all of the potential elements within there, it's really going to be a matter of walking through the wizard for configuring a conditional access policy. There are quite a few settings in there. Know what identity protection in Azure AD brings to conditional access. Specifically, it allows for evaluation of sign-in risk in that conditional access. So in a medium risk scenario, for example, we could present that user with an additional factor of authentication, or potentially in a high risk scenario, force that user to reset their password because compromise is likely. And I'm not saying a licensing question is going to for sure come up, but know the licensing required for Azure AD Identity Protection. So it requires Azure AD Plan 2 or one of the E5 level licenses, Microsoft 365 or EMS E5. It's not included in the E3 tier licenses. So just keep that in the back of your mind. If you see a scenario that includes implementing specific features and you see E3 or E5, know that if identity management's in play, if identity protection is in play, that E5 or that Azure AD Plan 2 is going to be required. All right. Number 3 is manage application access. This is going to be really all about app registrations, configuring app registration permission scopes, configuring permission consent, and managing API access to Azure subscriptions and resources. This is a topic that can get really complex. You can spend some serious time here. So I want to just tie down a few key bits of information that will help you prepare more quickly. So for the exam, a few bits of knowledge you'll definitely want to have under your cap. Understand what scopes are in the area of app registrations. The scopes are essentially groups of permissions, and scopes define actions an app can perform on behalf of a user. So when it comes to consent, delegated permissions grant app consent on behalf of a specific user, and application permissions grant app consent on behalf of any user. To put it another way, delegated permissions are generally used when you want to authenticate with the currently logged on user. So it typically involves a physical user and a user interface, where application permissions are for scenarios where no user is present, typically for API scenarios. So also, that application object that you see, there's two objects created in this registration process that you want to think about. The application object is a global representation of an app across all your tenants, and in the home tenant, they're listed under the app registrations blade in Azure AD. The service principal is a local representation of that global application object, and that's listed on the Enterprise Applications blade. And if you want to revoke access to an app, you're going to go to the Enterprise Applications blade, and you're going to delete that service principal. So in my AZ-500 exam prep guide, I have a link to a quick start tutorial that will walk you through creating that app registration creation process, as well as the revocation process, so revoking those permissions. So if you've never worked with app registrations before, absolutely worth spending a little time there. Also, in my LinkedIn Learning course on AZ-500, similarly, you will find a demonstration of all of those concepts in a very short amount of time. So let's dig into manage access control, which is the fourth and final area. So here we are configuring subscription and resource permissions, managing resource group permissions, configuring custom RBAC roles, identifying the appropriate role for a given scenario, applying the principle of least privilege. This should really just pervade all our thinking, interpreting permissions, and the check access feature. This last one may not be familiar to you. So if I need to quickly check the access level, the assigned roles to a user, a service principal, or a group, the check access feature under Identity and Access Management, or IAM, is going to be really important. So that was listed as a line item, so make sure you're familiar. But let's talk about best practices for Azure role-based access control. So you have the scope, which we've talked about in a couple of contexts, but the scope is really at what level are we assigning our permissions. So when we're thinking about role assignment or permissions, we can look at a high-level assignment like subscription, where when we assign a permission at a subscription level, that's going to give me access potentially to a whole bunch of resources within a subscription. Resource groups and resources. If I go down to the resource group level, I only have access to the resources within that resource group, or even at the resource level itself, which is going to be the lowest level. I then have to look at my role. So for folks that just need to look at what's happening, that's where the reader role comes in. We have, based on the service, a variety of resource-specific or even custom roles. That contributor role, you'll see the various flavors of the contributor role across services. That basically means that you have access to everything except the ability to assign permissions to others, basically, which is reserved for your admins. And then your resource level assignments are usually happening for automated processes, generally speaking. So for the exam, know those built-in Azure roles, especially those granting elevated permissions. That's going to come in really handy to understand those native roles and how to use them to delegate with least privilege. So if I'm delegating access to PIM, for example, I'm not going to just use global admins out of the box, because that's going to be too much. So I want to make sure that I know the roles that will allow me to dial it down and dial it into the right level. Know how to build an Azure custom RBAC role and the options for doing so. You can do it in the portal, the CLI, PowerShell, but at least give it a whirl in the portal. If you grab my AZ-500 exam prep guide, I've got a link to a quick start tutorial that will walk you through that process. And know how and when to interpret permissions in that check access feature. So again, grab the AZ-500 exam prep guide that's going to give you links to a lot of additional resources and viewing and training over on LinkedIn Learning, and it's free of charge. And that's it for installment number 1. Thanks for listening. Look for installment number 2 of 4 coming very soon. Make sure to give us a like and subscribe so you get the alert every time we throw up a new video, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.